Welcome to another quiet journey into history. If you enjoy peaceful stories about very uncomfortable times, leave a gentle like. Maybe even subscribe, but only if you feel like it. Tonight, we're going back to a time when the sun didn't just mark the end of the day, it marked the end of safety. This is the story of why people in the Middle Ages feared the night, even more than they feared death. The day ends, not with fireworks or lights or television, but with silence to eye in a world before electricity, before screens, before glowing clocks or buzzing street lamps. The setting of the sun was an event, a warning, and for many medieval people, it was the single most dreaded moment of their daily lives, because when the light vanished, something else took its place. Something cold, something ancient, something unknowable. Darkness, not just any darkness, but total, suffocating, unbroken dark. The kind of darkness where your own hand disappears in front of your face. The kind that swallows up the edge of the village and makes every sound feel closer. The kind where time seems to freeze and your heartbeat becomes louder than the wind outside. Night in the Middle Ages wasn't just the opposite of day. It was a separate realm entirely. A place with different rules, different dangers, and fewer protections. For people in medieval Europe, especially those living in rural areas, darkness didn't bring rest that it brought risk. For the peasant farmer who had spent his day in the fields, the setting sun meant a rush to finish chores before the world vanished. The animals needed to be shut in, the doors barred, fires stoked, candles lit, if they had them. Many didn't. Candles were expensive. Most homes had just the fireplace for light, and even that had to be carefully managed, because too much fire could burn the house down. Too little could invite something worse, the cold. In winter, that could mean death. As darkness fell, entire villages would retreat inside. The streets went silent. The fields were left empty. The market stalls were folded up, their wares hidden from thieves. Doors creaked closed and were bolted from within. Curtains drawn, shutters shut tight. And above all else, people kept quiet. There was a belief, not official church doctrine, but a deep cultural fear that noise in the night could attract unwanted attention, not just from bandits or wild animals, but from spirits, ghosts, demons, witches. People believed the veil between the physical world and the spirit world was thinner at night, that things hidden by daylight would emerge, that the souls of the damned could slip through the cracks in silence, looking for warmth or company or revenge. It sounds extreme now, but imagine living in a one-room wooden hut with a thatched roof and no windows. The only light is from a smoldering log in the hearth. Outside, the wind howls, and you hear footsteps. But no one should be out this late. You hear a knock. Just once. Then nothing. Would you open the door? Most people wouldn't. In fact, many homes had no way to open the door from the outside after dark. No knob. No keyhole. Just a heavy plank of wood slid into place, wedged between the door and the frame, to keep everything and everyone out. Inside, the family would sleep close together for warmth and for safety. Sometimes on straw, sometimes on wooden boards, sometimes on dirt floors. They said their prayers, often several, and hoped the night would pass without event. Some people even slept in shifts, especially in communities where wolves were common, or in towns where thieves had been spotted recently. There was always someone assigned to keep watch, even if just a tired old man sitting near the fire with a stick in his hand. And if you were lucky, the night passed quietly, but often it didn't. There were many threats at night, both real and imagined. Wolves could come into the village and snatch chickens, or worse. Fire could spread from a poorly banked hearth. A sick child could begin coughing and never stop. A neighbor could scream, and no one would dare go see why. But the fear of what might happen was often worse than what actually did. Fear itself was the constant companion. Superstition ruled the dark hours. People believed in creatures like the Naxarer, the night devourer, a corpse that fed on its own burial shroud and slowly sapped life from its living relatives. Or the alp, a nightmare demon that sat on your chest while you slept, causing choking, sweating, and fear. Nightmares were often interpreted not as dreams, but as spiritual attacks. Parents told stories to their children not to entertain them, but to keep them indoors, to keep them quiet, to keep them scared enough to obey. Children were warned not to look out the window after dark, not to whisper the names of the dead, not to speak to strangers near the well, because things with sharp ears and colder breath than winter. For hundreds of years, this fear shaped life itself. Whole towns were built with walls, not just to keep armies out, but to create a sense of security once the sun was gone. Inns locked their doors after a certain hour. Town watchmen rang bells not only to tell time, but to remind people curfew had begun. Stay inside. The lucky slept through the night, but even they would wake at the first sign of danger, a dog barking, a scream, a creak. Because deep down, everyone knew, when darkness came, so did the unknown, and the unknown was never good. This was the rhythm of life. Each day ended with a question mark. Will the fire hold? Will the cold come in? Will something come knocking? Will everyone wake up tomorrow? It's hard to imagine that now, in a world of phones, streetlights, and microwaves. But for the average person in the Middle Ages, night was not rest, that it was survival. And it would come again, every evening, no matter how badly they wished. It wouldn't, so they prayed. They huddled. They waited, and the darkness waited, too. They believed that, when the sun disappeared, so did God's protection. And in its place came everything else. Even if the night passed quietly, no wolf howls, no breaking glass, no missing neighbor, the fear remained. Quiet, heavy, constant. This wasn't irrational. It was learned, inherited, reinforced by stories, sermons, and real tragedies. Those who wandered at night without protection sometimes disappeared. Those who slept too close to the fire sometimes never woke. And those who claimed to see strange figures in the woods, well, people stopped asking them questions. And so, as the final light vanished from the stone cottage walls, and the soft scratching of rats in the thatch roof began, medieval people didn't celebrate nightfall. They endured it, slowly, 1 hour at a time, wrapped in furs, in silence, with eyes that refused to close. Because in a world without electricity, where every flame could be snuffed by wind, where medicine was guesswork and religion was the only comfort, darkness was not. The absence of light, it was the presence of fear. Even though most people slept through the darkest hours, the world outside kept moving. Night in the medieval period wasn't just a passive time. It was a time of real risk. And how dangerous that risk felt depended heavily on your social class. Let's start with the peasantry, which made up over 90% of the population in most European regions. For peasants, the home was usually a one-room structure with a dirt floor, no chimney, and walls made of wattle and daub or rough stones. Roofs were thatched and easily flammable. Sparks from a carelessly maintained fire could ignite a blaze in seconds. There are records of entire villages burning down from a single house fire started in the middle of the night. So families often took turns waking up to make sure the hearth stayed controlled. They didn't have lanterns to move around. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were sometimes used but were smoky, smelly, and expensive. So if someone needed to get up in the night, they had to feel their way across the floor in the dark, hoping not to step on a sharp tool, a chicken, or worse. ARAT.in towns. Things weren't much better, just more crowded. Most cities had curfews. Gates were locked. Guards patrolled, but protection wasn't reliable. If a fire broke out in one house, it could take dozens with it before anyone could act. Fire brigades existed only in the largest cities, and their tools were primitive at best. City dwellers might sleep in small rooms above their shops. Windows were covered with shutters, and glass was a luxury almost no one had. Noise from neighbors, animals, or fights in the alleyways was common. If someone cried out for help, the instinct was not to investigate, but to bolt the door tighter to iron castles or noble manors. The night was quieter, but no less vulnerable. Stone walls helped regulate temperature, but they also stayed cold. Noble families often slept in chambers with tapestries and rugs to keep in warmth. Servants slept on the floor nearby. Guards walked the corridors. Still, security didn't eliminate danger that a sick child in a noble house might get more attention, and a priest or healer could be summoned. But even with wealth, options were limited. Medicine was mostly guesswork, and disease didn't respect social class. If an illness struck after dark, the rule was the same. Wait until morning. If there is one. Now, let's talk about superstition, because it played a huge role in how medieval people experienced the night. Most villagers believed that demons and spirits were strongest between midnight and 3 a.m. This belief wasn't fringe, it was common across Europe. Some thought it was dangerous to say prayers too loudly during these hours, as it might draw unwanted attention from malevolent forces. People placed small religious icons or herbs near their bedding for protection. Charms made of iron were hung above doors. In some homes, children were taught never to speak if they woke up during demon hours, unless they had to. If someone had to leave the house, perhaps to check on animals, they often whispered protective prayers before opening the door. They didn't linger. A trip to the outhouse wasn't casual. It was fast, fearful, and silent. Women especially were discouraged from being outside after dark, both for safety and because of fear of association with witchcraft. A woman seen walking at 2 a.m. might be accused of dark dealings, especially if something bad happened in the village the next day. As the night dragged on, physical discomfort became a factor. There was no concept of ergonomic sleep. People slept on straw, old sacks, animal skins, or bare wood. Bugs were everywhere. Fleas, lice, and mites were impossible to avoid. If you were lucky, you slept through. If you were unlucky, you woke with an infection from a rat bite or a fever from untreated illness. The only hospital was prayer and endurance. The idea of restful sleep simply didn't exist for most people. It was survival sleep, enough to get through another day of labor. But let's not forget, weather mattered enormously. In winter, nights were brutal. No insulation. Cold air passed freely through walls. Fingers and toes went numb. Children were bundled in everything they owned. Sometimes, people slept with livestock to share body heat. If a fire went out and couldn't be revived, families huddled together just to make it to morning. In summer, the problem wasn't cold, it was insects. Flies, mosquitoes, and all manner of biting pests filled the house. Doors and windows stayed open to let air in, but that meant everything else came in too. People itched and swatted all night. There was no relief, only tolerance. Near the end of the night, somewhere between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m., the second sleep ended naturally. There were no alarms, just instinct. People rose stiffly, feeling the cold in their bones. Mothers stirred embers and prepared hot water if they could. Fathers might begin sharpening tools or checking the sky for weather. Children, if they were old enough, helped with animals or fetched kindling. A new day had begun, and with it came work. Always work, but underneath it all, the chores, the routine, the ordinary, was the knowledge that they had made it through the night. Again, because in the medieval world, each night was its own trial. There were no guarantees, and the sun coming up meant something that modern people rarely consider. You survived. Let's say, for a moment, that it's 2 a.m. in a small medieval village. The fire is low. Your eyes are heavy. You're bundled under 2 rough wool blankets, sharing body heat with 3 siblings. And suddenly, there's a noise outside. Not loud, just enough to notice. A scraping, maybe, or a faint knock. You try to ignore it, but it happens again. Your father quietly gets up. No one says anything. He picks up a dull wooden stick from the corner and creeps to the door. The latch is lifted, carefully, slowly. To avoid making noise, he opens the door just a few inches and peeks out. What happens next depends entirely on where you are and what's waiting. Let's be clear. Going outside at night in the medieval world was not something you did lightly. There were no streetlights, no flashlights. A candle or oil lamp might give you a foot or two of visibility, but even that was a luxury. Most people didn't have portable lighting. If you wanted to see, you relied on fire from the hearth, which obviously didn't move, or the moon. On a moonless night, total darkness. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Your feet disappeared. The path you walked daily was now a shapeless void. Oh, why would anyone risk going outside at night? Here are a few common reasons. An animal was giving birth or in distress. Someone in the household was sick and needed herbs, water, or help. A thief was suspected nearby. A cry was heard. Possibly someone in danger. You needed to relieve yourself and couldn't hold it. These were the only situations worth opening that door after midnight. If you stepped outside, here's what you'd face. First, the cold. Whether it's winter or not, night temperatures drop sharply. Humidity clings to your clothing. If it's raining, your feet are instantly soaked. Most people didn't own more than 1 or 2 pairs of shoes. What meant wet for days. Second, the silence. It isn't peaceful. It's unnerving. You're used to the constant noise of day, people, animals, tools. Now, every tiny sound becomes magnified. A twig snapping feels like a shout that you'd look out and, most likely, see nothing, but you'd feel watched. Because everyone in the medieval world believed that the night held eyes. Not always human, not always visible, but present. If you lived near the forest, things were worse. Wolves were a real threat. In some parts of Europe, especially France, Germany, and eastern regions, wolf attacks weren't rare. There are records from the 1300s of entire villages coordinating wolf watches. Children were never sent out alone. Nighttime howls were normal and terrifying. Other dangers included wild dogs, boars in forested areas, bandits or rogue travelers, diseased animals wandering from pastures. Even domestic animals could be dangerous. A spooked horse or cow could injure or kill someone if startled in the dark. City life didn't make it much better in medieval towns. Streets were narrow, muddy, and often served as open sewers. There were no designated sidewalks. If you stepped out in the dark, you could easily fall or injure yourself. Curfews were in place in many towns. Being caught outside after hours without permission could get you fined, beaten, or thrown in jail. If you weren't a watchman or on official business, you stayed indoors. Still, sometimes people had no choice. For example, midwives were occasionally summoned at night to assist with difficult births. They traveled alone or with an escort, carrying herbs, tools, and prayers. What did people do to protect themselves? Not much, but a few things. Some carried iron tools, believed to ward off evil. Others whispered protective psalms or charms under their breath. A few used animal bones or talismans around their neck. Most just moved quickly and quietly, hoping nothing noticed them. No one lingered. No one explored. The medieval night was not a place of curiosity. It was something to survive. Even religious figures avoided walking after dark unless absolutely necessary. And when they did, they recited scripture and stayed close to walls, doorways, or familiar paths. There are even records of people locking outhouses or placing bells on doors, just in case someone or something tried to come in. Did that sound paranoid? Not for them. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight. In their world, monsters didn't just exist in stories. They explained things you couldn't otherwise understand. Why someone fell ill. Why a cow gave no milk. Why your neighbor died in her sleep. The dark didn't need to justify itself. It just was. As dawn crept closer, the fear of being outside slowly faded. The first bird calls, the light softening on the horizon. These were signs of safety returning. If you were still alive, still inside, and had your fire going, you had one. Another night survived. If you're listening at night, maybe drifting towards sleep, take a moment and imagine yourself in a one-room wooden house. Thick air, cracked beams, one tiny fire burning in the hearth, glowing just enough to give you shadows. The floor is cold, the blankets are itchy, and your survival, whether you realize it or not, depends entirely on that fire, because if it goes out, even once, everything in your world changes. Tonight, we're staying in that small medieval home, not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as someone who lives there, who has to keep that fire going all night, or face what happens if it doesn't. Let's begin. The fire's role, not just heat. The first thing people today forget about medieval life is that fire wasn't optional. It wasn't for atmosphere. It wasn't even just about keeping warm. It was your primary tool. 4. Cooking, heating, lighting, protection, drying clothes, boiling water, processing herbs, making medicine, driving away animals, preventing rot and mold, signaling neighbors during emergencies. Everything you did relied on it. No fire, no food, no defense, no light, no hot drink to give a feverish child, no way to warm up after walking through cold rain. Fire was everything. So when people talk about keeping the fire alive, they don't mean it metaphorically. They mean it literally, the daily firekeeping routine. Let's look at what actually went into maintaining that fire. Every single day. You didn't start a new one every morning. You couldn't. Matches didn't exist. Tinder boxes were rare and expensive. Flint and steel worked, but only for skilled hands, and even then, not reliably. You couldn't afford to start over daily. So you kept the same fire burning constantly, letting it drop down to coals at night, then reviving it at dawn. Here's how a typical night went. Late evening. Add medium logs, enough to sustain heat, but not burn through too fast. Bedtime. Bank the fire, cover embers with ash to insulate them, slow their burn, and trap heat. Midnight. Lightly stir and turn the wood quietly so as not to wake the household. Before sunrise, remove ash, blow gently, add twigs or dried moss to bring flames back. Usually, one person was assigned to tend the fire at night. Sometimes the mother, sometimes the eldest child. It was a role of trust. Lose that fire, and you lost the village's respect. When the fire dies, let's say tonight, something goes wrong. Maybe you used the wrong wood. Maybe you banked the coals too early. Maybe there was a draft you didn't notice. But sometime in the night, maybe 2 a.m., maybe closer to dawn, the fire dies. One wakes up right away. It's subtle at first. The kind of chill that slides into the room like fog, brushing ankles, slipping past your layers. The warmth that used to wrap around you starts fading. Your toes begin to ache. The baby stirs. Someone coughs in their sleep. You pull the blanket tighter. Then someone wakes. Not fully, just enough to feel that something isn't right. They sit up, crawl across the dirt floor, and reach out toward the hearth and feel nothing. Not even warm stone. Just ash. Cold. Dead. Gone. And suddenly, the whole room is awake. Cold, fear, and immediate consequences now. The real problems begin, because that fire wasn't just for comfort. It was holding the entire house together. Fire equals no barrier between you and the night. The cold begins to bite. The damp air clings to the walls. Moisture creeps into the bedding. Small children cry. The elderly start to tremble. The pot of food left out to stew overnight is now useless. The chamber pot stinks, unmasked by the hearth's warmth. Rats may creep closer to the darkened space. The home becomes, slowly, invisibly, dangerous. If it's winter, the cold is more than uncomfortable. It's deadly. Children get sick. Older people stop moving. Warmth isn't just about how you feel. It keeps your immune system functioning, keeps limbs flexible, keeps sleep possible. But beyond the physical, there's a different kind of fear. Medieval beliefs about lost fire. To a modern person, fire is science. To a medieval person, Fire was also spirit. They believed each hearth had its own presence, a kind of household guardian. To let the fire die wasn't just neglect. It meant you'd angered something to here's what people believed could happen. Spirits could enter more easily in a cold house. The dead might wander closer to the living. Thieves or night travelers, a common folk term for witches, would take the opportunity to strike food cooked the next day in a restarted hearth might be cursed or empty, providing no nourishment. A fire that died might never come back the same. These weren't fringe beliefs. In 13th to 15th century Europe, household fire rituals were common and taken seriously. Some burned herbs like mugwort or sage at bedtime to please the hearth. Others placed iron tongs in a specific direction before sleep. Some whispered protective charms over the coals, not prayers, but phrases passed through generations. If the fire went out, especially multiple times, neighbors would talk. Had the family been cursed? Had someone failed in their duties? Was someone meddling with dark forces? The loss of fire could spark fear beyond what the cold air ever could. Trying to revive it, so what did you do? Step 1. Search the ashes. Maybe, just maybe, a single ember still hides beneath the gray. You remove the cover. Stir gently. Blow. Add straw. Nothing. You try again. Harder. You scrape the stone floor, hoping a spark catches. But still, nothing. So now, you face the worst option. You go outside. The search for fire, borrowing or starting from scratch. Going outside at 3 a.m. is a nightmare in the medieval world, especially in winter, especially barefoot. But if you want fire and can't relight it yourself, you have only two choices. Go to a neighbor's house and ask to borrow fire. Start a new fire from scratch using flint and steel. Let's look at both. Borrowing fire. You wrap yourself in a heavy cloak. You grab a clay pot with straw at the bottom. You walk into the darkness. You knock on someone's door, maybe the miller, maybe the family across the lane. You wait. If they answer, you say a few quiet words, an apology, a request. You ask for a coal. If they help you, you thank them profusely. If they don't, you walk back through the cold and try again somewhere else. And yes, some neighbors refused, especially if they thought you were cursed or careless. Fire was too valuable to give away freely, starting from scratch. If you had flint and steel and knew how to use it, you could try. But most peasants didn't own either. And even with them, you needed dry kindling, charred cloth, or fungus to catch the spark. Time and skill, patience. Most medieval people failed at this, especially under pressure. It wasn't like striking a match. It could take 30 minutes, or not work at all. What happens if you fail? If nothing works, you return home, defeated, cold, embarrassed, ash-covered, and now you face a different day than you'd planned. No warm breakfast, no hot water to clean with, no softening of yesterday's bread, no relief for sick children, no tea or medicinal herb infusion, no barrier against the morning frost. Worst of all, a sense of exposure. You start your day with weakness already inside your walls. The cows still need milking. The fields still need tending. The neighbors still gossip, and you're behind. All because one fire died, and no one noticed until it was too late. Sleep may be a universal human need, but in the medieval world, it wasn't experienced the same way by everyone. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, had a much more physical relationship with night and sleep. Their days were filled with exhausting labor, tilling soil, chopping wood, grinding grain, and that exhaustion usually forced sleep to come quickly. But even for them, the segmented pattern held. They'd often fall asleep shortly after nightfall, especially in winter when darkness stretched on for over 13 hours. A first sleep would carry them into midnight. Then they'd wake, not always by choice. The cold might wake them, a child crying, the wind howling through the cracks in the wall, or just the natural rhythm of their own bodies. The fire would need checking. Livestock might stir, and depending on the season, the sounds of distant howls or footsteps in the snow could prompt someone to look outside. After half an hour, maybe 2, they would settle again into the second sleep. Monks and nuns, by contrast, structured their nights around rigid schedules dictated by the rule of Saint Benedict or similar monastic codes. The canonical hours demanded that sleep be interrupted intentionally, regardless of whether the body was ready. A bell would sound in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., calling the faithful to matins, the first of the daily liturgical prayers. In dark, stone churches lit by flickering candlelight, they would chant psalms in Latin, barefoot or wrapped in wool, standing for long stretches. This wasn't a personal moment of wakefulness. It was organized, sacred, controlled. Afterward, they might return to bed briefly before rising again at dawn for lauds. The next prayer hour. In contrast, wealthier nobles lived in more insulated, better lit homes. Some even had private chambers. Yet they too followed the pattern of segmented sleep. They might spend their watch hours reading, composing letters by the fire, or engaging in quiet discussion. In some records, these middle-of-the-night hours were described as the best time for decision-making or reflection, a quiet intermission when the mind, undistracted by the day, was clearest. What did people think about the night watch? Unlike modern sleeplessness, this waking period wasn't seen as a problem. It wasn't insomnia. It wasn't treated as an illness. No one rushed to find a cure. There were no pills, no powders, no urgent whisperings of something's wrong. Instead, it was accepted. Common phrases appear in medieval letters and texts like, "I woke during the watch and thought of you. I took counsel in the silence between sleeps. Between the first and second rest, I lit the lamp and." Read from the Psalms. This was your time. You weren't expected to be productive in the modern sense. You didn't scroll. You didn't rush. You waited, thought, tended the fire. Let your body decide when it was ready to rest again. Some medical texts of the time even suggested this segment. This pause was healthy. That digestion, dreams, even fertility were positively influenced by this midnight GAEP.in fact. Some doctors recommended trying to wake up around midnight if you had a troubled mind. The silence, they argued, would help you see things clearly. Historical clues. How we know this. The idea of segmented sleep didn't come from modern theories. It came from history itself, from the margins of medieval documents and the pages of diaries, court records, and sermons. In 2001, historian Roger Kirch published research from 16 years of combing through such sources. He discovered more than 500 references to this two-part sleep, scattered across cultures and centuries. Writers in France, Italy, England, and even parts of Africa mentioned first sleep and second sleep as casually as we might say breakfast and lunch. Some examples. A 15th century medical manual advises couples to conceive children between first and second sleep, when the body is rested and passion renewed. In 13th century records from Norwich, a thief was said to have broken in betwixt first sleep and the second, as though this window was well known. In 17th century Spain, the phrase primer sueño, first sleep, appears in literature and common speech. Even Homer's Odyssey, written long before the Middle Ages, hints at characters waking in the night, walking about, then returning to sleep. This wasn't theory. It was lived reality. How the world changed it if segmented sleep was so natural. Why did it disappear? The answer lies in industrialization. In the 18th and 19th centuries, everything changed. The rise of factory schedules, clocks in every home, and the spread of artificial lighting pushed human sleep into a tighter, more compressed format. When gas lamps lit streets, and eventually electric lights filled homes, the natural cues of darkness disappeared. Night no longer meant stillness, it meant productivity. You could read, clean, talk, drink, even work well past sunset. Sleep had to be squeezed between two work shifts. So the watch, that silent pause between sleeps, slowly faded away. By the early 20th century, many people didn't even remember. It had existed. The forgotten rhythm today, we think something's wrong if we wake up at 2 a.m. We reach for our phones. We panic. We toss and turn, trying to force ourselves back to sleep. But for most of human history, waking in the night wasn't strange. It was normal. Expected. Even valued. People used it for thinking, praying, talking, loving, reflecting, sitting, still with themselves. Maybe there's something in that worth remembering. Segment 6. Why you'd be helpless without candles in the medieval night. Welcome back. If you're still with us, or even half asleep, thanks for staying on this slow ride through history. And if you haven't already, a quick nudge. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you can drift off to more forgotten chapters of the past. Now, tonight, we explore something deceptively small. A simple flame, a stub of wax, a fragile stick of tallow. In the middle. Ages, your ability to function after sundown depended on one thing. A candle. No candle meant no light. No light meant no activity. And no activity? That meant vulnerability to injury, fear, theft, spiritual anxiety, or worse so. What happened when that tiny flame flickered out? Let's find out. Total darkness first. Picture this, a medieval village at night. It's not just dim, it's black. Beyond the warm orange of the fire, there is nothing. No electric glow from a phone. No car headlights. No digital clocks. The world disappeared into the dark. If you needed to go outside, to check on animals, relieve yourself, or reach another home, you'd better hope for moonlight, because otherwise, you're stumbling blind. Candles weren't optional luxuries. They were lifelines. But here's the thing. Candles were expensive, painfully so for the lower classes. And they didn't burn for long. How much did a candle cost? A single candle, especially one made of beeswax, could cost a peasant a day's wages. That's right, one candle. Now, not all candles were beeswax. There were cheaper alternatives made from animal fat, known as tallow candles. But even those weren't exactly cheap, and they stank. When burned, they gave off a rancid, smoky odor that filled entire rooms. Still, for most households, it was all they could afford. So candles were rationed carefully, measured by the hour. Families might light one for supper, snuff it out immediately after, and spend the evening in darkness or near the fire, doing nothing that required sight. Monasteries kept detailed candle inventories. Nobles counted them before bed. And stealing candles was, in some towns, a criminal offense. Candles and faith candles weren't just practical. They were spiritual tools. In the deeply religious medieval world, darkness was more than a physical problem. It represented the unknown, the unholy, the demonic. Many feared what moved in the shadows. Evil spirits, lost souls, witches, demons, the devil himself. Lighting a candle wasn't just for sight. It was for protection. Churches were filled with candles. Holy icons were lit by them. People lit candles during prayers or left them burning beside shrines in hopes that light would carry their request upward to God. And when someone died, they lit candles to guide the soul to the afterlife. Losing your candle didn't just leave you blind. It left you spiritually unmoored. No candle, no safety at home. Without a candle, small tasks became dangerous. Fetching something off a high shelf, stepping over tools or pots on the floor, moving near a fireplace, using a knife, helping a child or elder in the night. A fall could break a limb. A stumble into a hearth could burn you. Misjudging a step on a ladder might kill you. Even childbirth, often done at home, required candles. Midwives carried special sets of them, and towns sometimes taxed residents to fund birthing candles. For the poor, without light, the most basic events turned life-threatening. Why they didn't just sleep early? It's tempting to think people just slept when it got dark. And yes, many did, especially in winter. But life still happened at night. Laborers woke before dawn to begin early work. Bakers fired ovens in pitch-black kitchens. Guards patrolled walls. Shepherds checked pens. priests rose for night prayers. All of these required light, and when firewood was low, that meant candles. The candle as a timekeeper. Candles also worked like clocks. Some were marked to burn an inch per hour. Monks tracked their schedule this way. So did cooks. So did scribes. When the wax burned to a certain line, it was time to switch tasks or pray or prepare for dawn. In this way, the candle didn't just provide illumination, it provided structure. When it vanished, so did your sense of time. Candles in the cold and in winter, everything got worse. Candles froze. Or rather, the tallow hardened. Cold weather made them difficult to light and easier to break. Wicks cracked, flames sputtered, and people hoarded candles desperately. During storms or snow, families would huddle together, lighting a single candle only in emergencies, then shielding it with hands, cloth, bowls, anything to run out of candles in January could mean days in pure darkness. Candle theft and black markets. You might not expect this, but in certain periods, candles were stolen, traded, or forged. In London, candle theft from churches was punishable by flogging or public shaming. Some towns had candle watchers, people assigned to monitor how many candles were burned during public events. And in war zones or during famine, stolen candles were sold on local black markets, just like grain. Psychological effects. Living without light shaped how people thought and felt. The dark was not cozy. It was not relaxing. It was threatening. Children feared it. Elders prayed during it. Travelers avoided it at all costs. It shaped language, with phrases like, "The devil walks after candles fall." "Only a fool speaks in darkness." "Better blind by day than sightless by night." A fragile flame. So the next time you light a candle, consider this, that fragile flame, flickering, small, and easily blown out. Once held the line between safety and danger, between clarity and fear, between calm and chaos. In the medieval night, a candle was more than wax, and wick. It was everything. The problem with privacy. Let's start with this basic truth. In the medieval period, most people didn't have rooms, let alone locked ones. Peasants, farmers, workers, they lived in one-room homes, often with dirt floors, shared with animals. There were no doors to bedrooms or closets. There were barely walls. One hearth, one roof, one space. Want to hide something? You buried it, or you hung it above the rafters. Even basic items, tools, dried meat, a needle, or a warm cloak, were vulnerable to neighbors, travelers, or opportunists. And the idea of locking them up was, for many, impossible. Why? Because locks were luxuries. Old key. Who could afford a lock? To understand how valuable a lock was, we need to remember how rare metalwork was. Locks were made by skilled blacksmiths, and they weren't cheap. A single small iron lock, the size of your palm, might cost a peasant family a week's income or more. The larger, more ornate locks used in cities or castles, those were custom jobs, commissioned by nobility or guild halls. If you were poor, you didn't have a lock on your front door. You had a wooden bar, a wedge, or nothing at all. At best, you might secure your door with a latch string, a bit of rope run through a hole in the wood. Anyone could pull it from the outside unless you removed the string at night. This meant that security was largely community-based. People trusted their neighbors because they had to. Theft didn't just threaten possessions, it threatened the fragile social balance that kept villages alive. What doors were actually like? The image of a solid, iron-bound wooden door is true for castles, but not for everyday homes. Most rural homes had thin, poorly fitted wooden planks nailed together, often without hinges. Doors were sometimes no more than a panel propped in place. Gaps let in wind, insects, and yes, wandering eyes. In cities, things were slightly better. Townhouses often had front doors with sliding bolts or basic internal bars. Merchants and wealthier families used hasps and staples, loops of iron, where a padlock could be applied. But even then, the locks were easy to pick by today's standards. And if someone wanted to break in, they didn't need tools. A strong shoulder and a few kicks would do. How people protected their belongings without locks. How did people protect their goods? 1. Burying and hiding. People hid money in chamber pots, behind hearthstones, or under floorboards. Small valuables might be wrapped in rags and hidden in hay or dung piles. Some even used hollowed-out bread loaves for storage. Point 2. Trust networks. A trusted neighbor or relative might hold your important item. A community elder or priest might serve as informal bank or vault. Point 3. Defensive animals. Geese were kept as night sentries. Loud, aggressive, and territorial, they were the medieval version of a home alarm system. Point 4. Never leaving home. Empty families rotated presence in the house. Going to market? Someone stayed behind. No one wanted to leave a home unattended, even for a few hours. What if something was stolen? If your item was stolen, what could you do? You couldn't call police. There were none. There were town watches or manorial courts, but justice was slow, public, and often humiliating. People accused of theft were dragged to public trial, often in the open air, judged by local lords or village assemblies. Proof was hard. The punishment, if found guilty, could range from flogging to branding, mutilation, or even execution, depending on the value of the stolen goods. But make no mistake, the system favored those with property. If you were poor, your loss might be ignored. If you were wealthy, your word might be enough to condemn someone else. Locks and power locks weren't just about security. They were about power. To have a chest with a lock signaled that you had something to protect. Guild masters locked their tools. Merchants locked their ledgers. Monks locked their reliquaries. Even keys themselves were symbols. A person carrying a large iron key on their belt wasn't just keeping something safe. They were in charge of something. Keys were worn by castle stewards, abbesses, and town officials. In fact, in some medieval communities, women who managed households wore keys as a sign of authority. A woman of keys wasn't just a housekeeper. She was the domestic manager, treasurer, and protector of the home. What if you lost the key? There were no backups, no duplicates, no locksmiths on speed dial. If you lost the key to your chest or coffer, you were in trouble. You either paid to have the entire lock smashed off or hired a blacksmith to forge a new one from scratch, a costly, time-consuming task. For this reason, keys were treated with paranoia. They were often worn around the neck, tied to belts, or stored in leather pouches near the skin. To lose a key wasn't just a mistake. It was a potential disaster. The nighttime threat night was especially dangerous. Doors were bolted or barred, and sounds outside were listened to with dread. Footsteps at midnight, whispering in the dark, a rattle on the doorpost. These things were taken seriously. There were no floodlights, no motion sensors, no cell phones. Just fear that a traveler on the road might be mistaken for a thief. A knock after sundown was answered with suspicion, or not at all. If you wanted to rob someone, you didn't need hacking skills or weapons, just time, patience, and darkness. A final thought. So imagine your own home. The walls, the locks, the doors, the keys. Gone. You've got one wooden plank over the opening. Maybe a latch string, maybe a bar. Inside, your tools, your bread, your wool, your child. Would you sleep well? In the medieval world, most people didn't. They didn't have locks, and that meant they didn't have peace. No showers, no sinks, no plumbing. Let's begin with the obvious. There were no showers. No indoor bathtubs, except in the wealthiest homes. No plumbing systems with pressurized water, no heated faucets, no drains. Water had to be drawn by hand from a well, stream, or river. You carried it home in buckets, usually wooden or ceramic. If you were lucky, your village had a communal well. If not, it might be half a mile away. Want to wash your face? Someone had to fetch the water first. Want a warm bath? You had to haul multiple buckets of water, heat them over a fire, pour them into a tub. If you even had one, share the bath water with others, starting with the eldest, or most important. Member of the household bathing was labor-intensive, expensive, and often reserved for special occasions, not daily routine. Communal bathhouses. Until they weren't in cities, there were public bathhouses, and they were quite popular during the High Middle Ages, around the 12th to 14th centuries. Men and women bathed, sometimes separately, sometimes not. Steam rooms, warm soaking tubs, and even massages were available. Think of it as a mix between a spa and a tavern. But there were two problems: morality and reputation. Over time, bathhouses gained reputations as places of vice and sin. Accusations of prostitution, drunkenness, and disease led moral authorities, especially the church, to push back against their use. Disease and fear. With outbreaks of plague and pox, people grew fearful that bathing might cause illness. By opening the pores to bad air. This was based on humoral theory, a medieval idea about how bodily fluids governed health. So, despite early enthusiasm for public bathing, the practice declined in many parts of Europe by the late medieval period. By the 1500s, regular bathing had become suspect in many circles. What about soap? Soap existed, but it wasn't what you're picturing. There were two main types: lye soap, made from animal fat, and lye, an alkaline solution made from ash. It was harsh, caustic, and often damaged skin. Aleppo or Castile soap, made with olive oil, imported from the Middle East or Mediterranean. Softer and gentler, but very expensive. For most people, soap was reserved for laundry or ritual hand washing. It wasn't used daily on skin, especially not faces. Instead, people cleaned themselves with rags, scrape tools, sand, or simply rinsing with water alone. Smell and social norms. So, what did people smell like? The answer: different, but not always unbearable. Clothing absorbed odors, of course, but daily sweating, smoke from fires, animal smells, and natural oils all blended into what was simply the norm to mask unpleasant smells people used. Herbs and flowers in their clothes, perfumed waters for hand washing, vinegar rinses for hair and scalp pomanders, small containers of scented substances worn around the neck. And remember, everyone lived with these smells. What would seem strong to us today was just normal life then. Cleaning clothes, laundering clothes, was a massive task. Clothing was soaked, beaten, and scrubbed with ash, lye, or clay. This was often done at communal washhouses or riverbanks. Afterward, clothes were wrung by hand, then hung to dry, often taking days. Most people owned only one or two sets of clothes. You wore the same outer garments for weeks. Underclothes might be changed more frequently, but still, nothing close to modern hygiene standards. Feet, teeth, and hair. Let's take it piece by piece. Feet, often washed more than other parts, since they were in contact with dirt. Warm foot baths were common in wealthier households, especially in the evenings. Teeth, brushed with chewed sticks, linen rags, or even powdered charcoal, salt, or mint. Toothpicks were also used, often fancy, silver ones by nobles. Hair was rarely washed with water. Instead, people combed their hair vigorously, oiled it, and treated lice with vinegar, rosemary, or combing powders made from crushed herbs. Hats and head coverings weren't just for fashion. They kept hair cleaner longer. Disease and dirt. Did medieval people understand the link between dirt and disease? Not in a modern scientific way, but they did know that filth invited sickness. Monasteries had rules about hand washing. Hospitals had dedicated bathing rooms. People associated bad smells with bad health, the theory of miasma. So yes, even if they misunderstood the mechanism, they tried to fight dirt and maintain hygiene. But without access to modern supplies, many of those efforts were crude and ineffective. Ritual and cleanliness. For many, cleanliness was also spiritual. Religious washing was part of life. Wudu, ritual ablution. In Islamic communities, holy water and baptism. In Christian rituals, hand washing before meals. And monasteries in this way Washing wasn't just about dirt. It was about purity, respect, and spiritual order. Why you'd struggle today if you lived back then. Here's what you'd have to give up. Hot showers, private bathrooms, fresh-smelling clothes, clean sheets, toothpaste, daily soap smooth, perfumed skin instead. You'd wake up in a cold room. Wash your face in a cracked basin with yesterday's water. Put on the same old tunic for the 7th day in a row, and pray your neighbors didn't notice the smell. That's what clean meant then. The reality of cold without insulation first. Understand this. There was no insulation. Walls were made of wattle and daub, woven wood packed with mud, rough timber, or bare stone. None of it was airtight. Wind howled through the cracks. Snow sometimes blew indoors through unsealed gaps in windows or thatched roofs. Windows. If you were lucky enough to have one, it was probably just a wooden shutter or oiled parchment stretched across a frame. Glass was a luxury, uncommon and unbelievably expensive. There were no carpets, no wall insulation, and no central heating. The floor? Packed earth or cold stone. Imagine a night in February with your breath fogging the air inside your house. That was normal. The hearth that never slept, this central fire, was the beating heart of any home. Not just for cooking, but for survival. It burned constantly, day and night. Someone, usually a child or elder, was tasked with tending it during sleeping hours to make sure it didn't die out. That if it did, you had to walk to a neighbor's home to borrow live coals or reignite it with flint and steel, which could take hours in frozen conditions. Chimneys were rare in poor homes. Instead, smoke filled the room, rising to the rafters and staining every surface black. But that smoke served a purpose. It kept insects away. It cured meats hung above. It even preserved the thatched roof by coating it in soot. So yes, people chose to live in smoky homes. The air might have been unbreathable, but the alternative was frostbite. How people actually slept. Forget memory foam. Forget heated blankets. Beds were straw mattresses or sacks stuffed with reeds. If you had money, maybe a wooden frame with a wool-stuffed mattress and a fur blanket. But for most, straw, layered with blankets made of rough wool, maybe some animal hides. Families often slept together in one bed, not just for warmth, but because it was the only one. Children, parents, and sometimes even animals, goats, dogs, chickens, shared the same sleeping space. Clothes weren't removed at night. In fact, people added layers. Nightshirts, cloaks, hoods, and even boots were sometimes worn to bed. The goal wasn't comfort. The goal was to not freeze to death. The art of layering, medieval style. Let's talk about what people wore to fight the cold. No Gore-Tex, no fleece, no waterproof boots. Instead, people relied on layering natural materials, linen undergarments, worn against the skin, woolen tunics on top, often 2 or 3 at once, hooded cloaks, sometimes lined with fur, wool hose for the legs, leather shoes or boots, sometimes stuffed with straw or moss for warmth. Gloves and scarves existed, but were not common among the poor. Many just wrapped hands in cloth and tucked them into sleeves. Hats were critical. Warmth was believed to escape through the head, and that belief is mostly correct. So people wore coifs, wool caps, or layered hoods even indoors. That if you went out without these layers, you would not last an hour in a bad storm. Eating for warmth and survival. Keeping warm wasn't just about fire and clothes. It was about calories. Winter diets were heavy on porridge and stews, thick, calorie-dense, and kept on the fire all day. Bread, baked in bulk and stored. Salted meats, preserved in late autumn for winter use. Cabbage, turnips, onions, and beans, the few vegetables that could last. Ale and warm milk, often mulled with herbs. Hunger was common. Many peasants ran low on food by February, known historically as the starving month. Children, the elderly, and the already sick were especially vulnerable. Outdoor life, rare and dangerous. People avoided going outside unless they had to. There were no snowplows. Roads turned to ice ruts or mud trenches. A journey of a mile or two could take half a day. Snow-soaked clothing quickly, and without waterproof gear, you'd be wet and cold for hours, which was often fatal. Even chores like gathering wood or fetching water were done quickly, with numb fingers and frozen shoes that if your home didn't have enough wood, you froze that if you're well iced over. You risked dehydration, even surrounded by snow. Cold was a killer, quiet and slow unlike war or plague. Cold killed silently. People slipped into hypothermia without realizing it. A sleepy child on a straw bed could simply never wake up. An old man tending fire in the early morning might freeze at the hearth. Even wealthy people weren't immune. If the fire went out or servants failed to close shutters, nobles died too. There are records of entire families found frozen in their homes after sudden temperature drops. The psychological toll cold wasn't just physical. It wore people down mentally. Sunlight was scarce. Days were short. The inside of a medieval home inn. Winter was dim, smoky, and silent. People suffered from what we'd now call seasonal depression, but there were no words for it. Just exhaustion, sadness, and dread. Superstition often filled the void. Beliefs that evil spirits roamed more freely in the cold, or that illness came from the frozen humors of the body. Winter was not a festive season for most. It was a time of endurance, and nothing more. Could you survive it? So let's say we put you in a small cottage. One room, one hearth, no glass windows. You've got a single blanket, 2 wool tunics, straw boots, a pot of turnip stew, and a week of snow outside. No lights. No Netflix. No heater. No door that seals. Would you make it? Because for most people in the medieval world, barely making it was all they could hope for. The end of daylight was the end of visibility first, and most obviously, no electricity. No streetlights. No flashlights. Not even widespread candles that if the sun was down, the world became pitch black. Even indoors, lighting was limited to a hearth, a torch, or a single candle. Most households rationed their candles. They were made of tallow or beeswax and not easily replaced. Outside, darkness meant you couldn't see who was approaching where the road curved if a step was missing. If someone or something was waiting in the shadows, people knew this. So they avoided being outside after dusk whenever possible. In many villages, movement ceased completely once the sun dipped below the horizon. Asterisk doors were barred. Literally, when night fell, families didn't just close their doors, they sealed them. Many homes had wooden crossbars to secure the door from the inside. Some even moved furniture to reinforce the entrance. Windows were shuttered tightly. If they had fabric or wooden coverings, they were drawn and locked into place. This wasn't about weather. It was about keeping danger out. There were no police patrols, no emergency response. If someone entered your home at night, you were on your own. People learned to listen carefully, to footsteps in the distance, to the creak of wood outside, to the bark of a dog. Every sound was magnified by silence. That it wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct. Wild animals came closer at night. Another reason people stayed indoors after sunset. Animals moved in. Wolves were common across much of Europe during the medieval period. Foxes, wild dogs, and boars also wandered into settlements at night. Especially in winter when food was scarce, if your home was near a forest, you were even more vulnerable. Livestock were targeted. Chickens vanished. Sheep were dragged away. Pigs panicked in their pens. In more remote areas, people lost family members to nighttime animal attacks, dragged off into the dark, never seen again. Without fences, without motion-activated lights, and without tools to fight back, you locked your doors and hoped nothing was hungry that night. Fire was both a comfort and a threat. Most homes had a fire burning all night for heat, especially in colder months. But an open flame in a wooden house, with a thatched roof and no emergency services, it was a constant risk. If the fire wasn't managed properly, sparks could catch the ceiling. Embers might roll onto the floor. Chimneys, if you had one, could clog and fill the house with smoke. Fires started at night were harder to detect until it was too late. Some villages kept night watches whose only job was to walk the streets and smell for smoke. In towns where houses were stacked side by side, a single house fire could consume a neighborhood, so people feared what fire could do in the dark and never slept deeply near it. Architecture was designed for nighttime safety. Even village layouts reflected the threat of night. Houses were clustered tightly together for mutual protection. Narrow alleyways made it harder for attackers to move quickly. Doors often faced inward toward a shared courtyard, not outward to the road. Small windows were placed high to prevent climbing. In towns, gates were shut at dusk. No one was let in or out until morning. Some castles and manors had watchmen whose entire duty was walking the grounds in total silence, just listening. They carried bells to signal trouble and torches to light their way. And even in peaceful regions, these measures were never skipped. Night was never taken lightly. The psychological effect of darkness. Lastly, we can't ignore the mental impact of the night. The world was silent, isolated, cut off. In small villages, there were no sounds of traffic, no humming lights, no phones. Just wind, creaking wood, and maybe the soft crackle of a fire. This silence created space for worry. What if someone was lurking? What if your animal pens were breached? What if the fire went out? What if someone was outside your window? Sleep was never fully restful. Someone in the house was always half awake, listening, because they had to be. Could you handle just one night? So imagine this: that you're alone in a one-room cottage. No windows. The fire is burning low. Your food is locked in the cellar. Outside, you hear something. A crack, maybe a footstep. Maybe nothing. Do you open the door? Or do you sit in silence, staring into the darkness, and hope whatever's out there stays out there? That was the medieval night. And people feared it for very real, very rational reasons. What was the night watch? In medieval villages and towns, the night watch was a system of patrol made up of either designated individuals, rotating citizens, or in larger towns, paid guards. Their duty was simple in theory: stay awake, keep moving, detect threats, sound the alarm. But in practice, it meant facing every fear the rest of the village was hiding from. There were no weapons, no uniforms, no radios. Just a torch, a wooden staff, maybe a horn, and your own courage. Who had to do it? In small communities, the watch wasn't optional. It was expected. Most villages used a rotational system. Each household took turns providing a man for night duty. If someone refused, they might face fines or public punishment. Sometimes, wealthier villagers paid substitutes to take their place. Younger men, or those with no children, were often pressured into extra shifts. After all, they were strong or had less to lose. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality. In towns, the night watch evolved into an organized force, sometimes under the control of the reeve or bailiff. These watchmen were paid, but not much, and only in places that could afford it. For most rural villages, it was unpaid, cold, and risky. The patrol routine the night was divided into watches, periods of several hours, usually. First watch, dusk to midnight. Second watch, midnight to dawn. Watchmen walked slowly through lanes, alleys, and outer paths. They passed homes, barns, animal pens, granaries, and wells. They listened for unusual sounds: barking dogs, footsteps that shouldn't be there, crackling that could mean fire, and they looked as much as darkness allowed. If they saw something suspicious, they had two choices: investigate alone or blow the watch horn, a carved wooden instrument loud enough to alert the entire village. Fire was their worst enemy, the number one fear of every watchman. Fire, thatched roofs, dry timber, open flames. A single ember could cause a village-wide disaster in under an hour. Watchmen were trained, if you could call it that, to Smell smoke in the wind, watch for orange flickers in upper windows, knock on doors if a chimney looked wrong, bang on. Shutters to wake sleeping families. Every village had a bucket chain system for firefighting. But that only worked if someone caught the fire early, and usually, that someone was the night watch. Animals, thieves, and runaways beyond fire. The second most common threat was intruders, both animal and human. Night watch duties included checking livestock enclosures for signs of tampering, scaring away foxes or wolves, watching for grain thieves or barn raiders, stopping runaway servants or apprentices trying to slip away under cover of darkness. In some regions, travelers caught moving after dark were stopped and questioned. If they couldn't give a convincing reason, they might be jailed or worse. Assumed to be criminals, being outdoors at night made you suspicious by default. Exposure and fatigue. Night watch wasn't heroic. It was miserable. The cold seeped through wool and leather. Wind howled through empty lanes. Sometimes you weren't just tired. You were sick, hungry, or both, and sleep deprivation added danger. Falling asleep on duty could mean missing a fire or being robbed while unconscious. Watchmen often leaned against walls or trees to rest, but only briefly. A good watchman kept walking, no matter what, feet blistered, legs cramped. But quitting wasn't an option, a job no one wanted. But everyone needed. Being part of the night watch meant protecting others, often at your own expense. There was no glory, no applause, just aching legs, burning eyes, and, if you were lucky, an uneventful night. But if something did happen, you'd be remembered as the one who woke the village, who sounded the horn, who risked yourself when others were asleep. And maybe, for that one night, the village was safe, only because you didn't close your eyes. A clear mental deadline. The disappearance of the sun in modern life. We structure our evenings around hours: 6 p.m. dinner, 10 p.m. sleep, maybe midnight for the restless. But in the medieval world, especially for peasants, the sunset itself was the deadline, not a rough guide. A rule. The moment the sun touched the horizon, everything shifted. Children were called inside. Tools were put away. Food was finished. Anyone still out in the fields was already late. Evening wasn't for relaxing. It was for preparing, because once it got dark, it became unsafe to move at all. There were no second chances. Once night took over, you were stuck where you were until morning. Architecture built for defense, not comfort. Houses were often simple structures, but they were designed with night in mind. Some things seem crude to us now, but they were born of necessity. Doors, often thick planks with inner crossbars, metal. Fixtures, if affordable, added strength, reinforced by benches or shelves at night. Windows, small, high, and sometimes barred, covered by shutters, boards, or waxed cloth, positioned to reduce visibility from outside entrances, rarely opened. After sundown, sometimes bricked or double-locked. For winter, the home was a shell, but it was meant to be sealed. It wasn't about keeping warmth in. It was about keeping everything else out. Internal routines, the lockdown ritual. When the sun began to lower, every household went into motion. Think of it as a ritual, passed down through generations, repeated nightly without fail. Animals were moved to secure pens or brought indoors. Cooking was finished and fires managed. Buckets were filled with water in case of fire. Doors were bolted. Windows shuttered. Tools were hidden or stored. Especially anything sharp or valuable. Families accounted for each other. No one should be out. Some households would even nail wooden bars across their doors from the inside. Not because they feared invasion every night, but because not doing so was seen as reckless. It wasn't superstition. It was policy. Lighting, sparse, strategic, and short-lived. Candles and oil lamps weren't lit freely. They were expensive and dangerous. Instead, one hearth or fire was kept burning low. A candle might be lit for 30 to 60 minutes during meals. Wicks were pinched out early to avoid fire risk. Some rooms were never lit at all. Families didn't move around the house after dark. They settled into one room and stayed put. Even minor movements could be risky. Trip over a bucket, drop a coal, knock over a candle, and you had a crisis in complete darkness. Night clothes, tools, and habits once locked inside. Medieval families settled into evening-specific behaviors. Children were dressed in layered woolen wraps, not sleepwear. Clothes that could be worn outdoors in case of emergency a fire. Poker or staff might be kept within reach. Water and dry food were positioned close to where people slept. Sharp tools were stored well away from the hearth. A safety habit to prevent injury in the dark. People didn't go to bed the way we think of it. They simply laid down, often on straw or shared bedding, near the fire or each other, under heavy blankets. Night wasn't for rest. It was for waiting, enduring. No help coming until morning. One of the biggest mental weights medieval people carried at night was this: no one could come help you. No town guard, no village bell. Except for fire or war. No doctor, no messenger if something went wrong. Injury, illness, fire, noise, or worse, you couldn't just wake someone. You'd have to wait until the sky began to gray and birds stirred. That helplessness built a culture of hyper-preparedness. Every person was taught to anticipate disaster and plan for it. Community boundaries, locked villages in larger settlements. It wasn't just homes that locked up. Entire villages were sealed. Gates at entry roads were shut and barred. Night watchmen controlled passage through central squares. No visitors were allowed without specific approval. Even dogs were brought in, not just to protect them, but to keep them from alerting to every rustle. If someone was seen walking after dark, they were either on duty, fleeing, or up to no good. Suspicion was automatic, and it had consequences. Living in anticipation of night. The deeper reality is this: medieval people didn't just fear the night at night, they feared it all day. Their days were structured around the coming dark, making sure nothing important was left outside. No tools misplaced, no gaps in the wall unpatched, no food forgotten, no person unaccounted for. The sun was not just light, it was a countdown clock. When it dipped, time was up. The depth of darkness. When night fell in medieval Europe, darkness wasn't a dim or twilight state. It was often complete and absolute. Thick forests, stone walls, and dense village clusters blocked what little moonlight or starlight might shine through. Overcast skies and long winters made nights even darker and longer. Indoors, the only light came from small hearth fires or scarce candles, often kept low or extinguished early to conserve fuel. This level of darkness created a visual void. Without light, people lost the ability to see familiar landmarks, pathways, or even the faces of their companions. They were left blind to their surroundings, which brought with it an intense vulnerability. The sound of silence. Darkness was not the only sensory challenge. As night deepened, sound itself changed. Without human activity, villages fell deathly silent. Animals quieted or moved furtively. Even the wind seemed muffled among the stone and timber. This silence was not peaceful. It was unnerving. People relied heavily on sound for information. Footsteps, barking dogs, creaking wood, rustling leaves. When those sounds stopped, or when new, unfamiliar noises broke the silence, fear instantly rose. Sensory deprivation and its psychological effects. Modern science shows that total darkness and silence cause the brain to heighten other senses, but they also increase anxiety and imagination. Medieval people experienced this keenly. In the dark, their hearing became sharper, but also prone to misinterpret sounds. The absence of sight and familiar noises left space for doubt and worry. Being unable to confirm what was around them bred hypervigilance, a state where every small sound could signal danger. This was not paranoia, but a natural response to the environment. The safety of staying still. Because moving in the dark was risky and disorienting, people learned that the safest place was usually stillness. They would sit quietly, breathing softly, and listen, waiting for the night to pass. This stillness also helped preserve their limited light and reduced the risk of accidents inside dark homes. Small flickers of control, candles, and fire. The few candles or fires that burned at night weren't just practical. They were psychological tools. That a flickering flame was a small island of safety in the sensory void. Families gathered around fires, not just for warmth, but to maintain a sense of connection and control over the darkness. Night as a time to hide, not act unlike daytime, which was for labor and socializing. Night was a time to minimize activity. People hid behind walls, stayed in clusters, and avoided making noise. This wasn't just a cultural norm, it was a survival mechanism. The danger of the unknown, the complete loss of sensory cues, made the night a blank slate for danger. Without being able to see or hear clearly, every shadow, every sound, became a potential threat. This unknown, this uncertainty, was one of the greatest fears people face. So, as you lie there, perhaps in darkness yourself, think about how much your senses are relied on, and what it would be like if they suddenly failed. The medieval night was a world where not knowing was the greatest fear of all. Wild animals. The night hunters in medieval Europe. The countryside was home to many predators: wolves, foxes, wild boars, and sometimes bears or lynxes prowled forests and fields. While most avoided villages, the cover of darkness allowed them to come closer in search of food, especially livestock. Sheep, pigs, and chickens were easy prey. Villagers knew this well. Losing animals meant not just loss of food, but often financial ruin. That's why many animals were kept in secure pens, or even inside homes overnight. Wolves. The most feared among all animals, wolves held a special place in people's fears. Packs could sneak close to villages undetected. They howled at night, sending chills through anyone who heard them. Wolves were seen as not just predators, but symbols of wilderness and chaos. Some villagers kept dogs specifically to warn of approaching wolves. Hunting wolves was dangerous and difficult. So many lived in constant anxiety during the long nights. Foxes and smaller predators. Foxes were clever and cunning, known for stealing chickens or disturbing grain stores. They were less dangerous than wolves, but far more common and a persistent nuisance. Because of their small size and stealth, foxes were particularly feared at night. Bandits and highwaymen. As dangerous as wild animals were, humans posed an even greater threat. Travelers, traders, and villagers moving after dark risked encountering bandits, robbers, or highwaymen. Darkness was their ally, a perfect cover for ambushes. Villages enforced strict curfews partly to prevent people from wandering into these dangers. Why bandits feared the daylight less? Bandits preferred night for a reason. Darkness concealed their faces and numbers. It disoriented victims. It limited the chances of being caught by guards or townsfolk. Travelers often carried weapons and tried to travel in groups to avoid attacks, but many simply avoided nighttime travel altogether. The importance of village gates and locks. Villages often had gates and walls, sometimes just wooden fences, closed at sundown. This physical barrier was the first line of defense against bandits and wild animals. Being locked inside was more than tradition, it was survival. Self-defense at home. Because of these threats, villagers prepared themselves at home, keeping weapons like axes or pitchforks near the hearth, using heavy doors and locks, training family members in basic defense, staying alert for unusual noises. Night was a time of vigilance, not rest. The harsh reality: medieval nights were not peaceful. Every howl, every footstep, every crack could be a signal of danger. That's why medieval people dreaded the night. It was a time when the wild, the unknown, and the violent converged. The night watchmen and guards. One of the clearest examples of night labor in medieval times was the role of night watchmen or guards. Villages, towns, and cities employed individuals to patrol streets and walls during the night, protecting inhabitants from bandits, fires, and other threats. These watchmen carried torches or lanterns to illuminate their path, were equipped with simple weapons, clubs, spears, or swords to defend against attackers. Followed specific patrol routes and schedules, often blew horns or rang bells to signal danger. Despite their training, these roles were dangerous and required vigilance, courage, and an ability to navigate the dark. Blacksmiths and bakers, night labor for daily needs. Some tradespeople worked through the night to meet essential demands. Blacksmiths, the forging of tools and weapons, could not always wait until day. Bakers, baking bread often started before dawn, requiring preparation during the dark hours. These workers learned to use firelight and their intimate knowledge of their craft to function despite poor visibility. Their work was critical to village survival and required adaptability to night's challenges. Miners and others in subterranean darkness. Certain workers, such as miners, operated mostly underground, where darkness was constant. For them, night was no different from day, as they used lamps and torches in enclosed spaces. Their experience shows how humans adapted to darkness with technology and skill, albeit in hazardous environments. Mariners and fishermen on night waters fishing, especially for certain species, took place at night. Fishermen used lanterns and simple signals to navigate and catch fish. Mariners sailing near coasts or rivers often traveled at night to reach ports by morning. Their knowledge of the stars and waterways was crucial, and they developed specialized skills to overcome the risks of darkness. The challenges faced by night workers. Night labor was not without risks. Workers had to overcome limited visibility leading to accidents, increased threat of attack from bandits or wild animals, fatigue and disorientation caused by working when the body's natural rhythms suggested rest. Social stigma, as night activity was often viewed with suspicion. Despite this, the necessity of their work meant they had to endure and adapt. Tools and techniques for night work. Medieval night workers used several strategies, relying on firelight from torches, lanterns, and hearths, developing heightened sensory awareness, using touch and hearing more than sight, working in teams for safety and assistance, limiting movement to familiar areas to avoid accidents. These adaptations made night labor possible, though always more difficult than daytime work. The social view of night workers. Those who worked at night often occupied a unique social position. Some were respected for their bravery and skill. Others were viewed with suspicion or fear, linked to the unknown or supernatural because of their unusual hours. Night workers thus lived on the edges of normal medieval social life, bridging the gap between day's safety and night's danger. Conclusion: courage in the dark. Night labor in medieval times was a testament to human resilience. Despite the overwhelming fear and dangers of darkness, some people defied the night to keep society functioning. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest times, human necessity and courage push forward. The impact of winter's long nights. Winter brought the longest nights of the year, sometimes up to 16 or 17 hours of darkness in northern regions. This extended period of darkness intensified existing fears. More hours to worry about predators or bandits. Greater chances for accidents or illness going unnoticed. Increased isolation and vulnerability as daylight hours to work and socialize were limited. Long nights meant more time indoors, leading to greater dependence on community and heightened anxiety. Winter preparations and adaptations. To cope with winter's darkness and cold, medieval villagers stored extra food and firewood to survive long periods indoors. Reinforced physical barriers, knowing that snow and ice might limit travel or escape. Extended community watch hours, understanding that threats could last all night. Relied on storytelling and social gatherings to maintain morale despite the gloom. These adaptations were critical to surviving harsh winters, summer's shorter nights, and reduced fear. In contrast, summer offered shorter nights and longer daylight. People could complete more tasks before darkness, reducing the need to be active at night. Nighttime fears lessened due to the brief duration and warmer temperatures. Animals and bandits might also be less active at night because of heat or food availability. However, summer nights still held their own dangers, such as insects or occasional storms. Seasonal work and nighttime activity. Seasonal labor affected night behaviors. Harvest season often demanded late work, sometimes into twilight or early night. Festivals and social events in warmer months extended activity into the night, temporarily easing the fear of darkness. This flexibility showed how medieval people balanced necessity, culture, and fear, how weather influenced nighttime fear. Weather conditions affected night safety and anxiety. Fog, rain, and snow limited visibility and muffled sounds, increasing unease and accidents. Wind could carry sounds that stirred fears of ghosts or predators. Clear, starry nights sometimes brought comfort and aided navigation. Villagers learned to read these signs and adjust behavior accordingly. Seasonal variation in wildlife behavior. Animals behave differently depending on season. Predators might be more active in winter, seeking scarce food. Some animals hibernated or migrated, changing the type of nighttime threats. Livestock required more care in cold months, increasing nighttime vigilance. Understanding these patterns was essential for survival. Psychological effects of seasonal darkness. Long winter nights could deepen psychological stresses. Extended isolation and darkness contributed to anxiety and fear. Communities relied more heavily on shared stories and rituals to cope. The cyclical nature of seasons gave hope that darkness would end, a crucial mental relief. Seasonal rhythms shaped not just behavior, but mental resilience. Summary: seasons. As a lens to understand medieval night, seasonal changes were not just environmental, but deeply affected how medieval people experienced night. Long, cold winters heightened fear and required strict routines. Short summers brought relief, but did not erase the ever-present dangers of darkness. The increased danger of accidents in the dark without artificial lighting. Night posed a serious hazard for accidents. Common incidents included falls down stairs, into wells, or over obstacles near the home or village paths. Cuts and burns caused by handling tools or fires without clear vision. Animal bites or scratches during nighttime. Livestock care. Since injuries often went unnoticed until morning, many worsened overnight. The threat of sudden illness at night. Some illnesses or medical emergencies appeared suddenly at night. Fevers or chills could worsen without immediate care. Respiratory problems, such as coughing or breathing difficulties, often became more severe in cold, damp conditions. Childbirth, a common and dangerous night event, demanded urgent attention despite darkness. Lack of light and medical knowledge made treatment difficult. Limited access to medical help after dark. Medieval villages rarely had 24-hour medical providers. Barriers to reaching healers or midwives at night increased risks. Families often provided first aid themselves, using herbal remedies or traditional knowledge. Serious cases might have to wait until dawn, increasing mortality or complications. This gap added anxiety to the night. Home remedies and nighttime care. People relied on home remedies, passed down through generations, to treat injuries or illnesses. At night, poultices made from herbs to reduce swelling or infection. Warm compresses for aches or chills. Simple stitches or bandaging using linen or cloth scraps. These measures were often rudimentary but essential. The role of midwives and night births. Midwives played a vital role, especially at night. Childbirth could happen at any hour, and midwives often traveled or stayed overnight with expectant mothers. They used lamps or candles to see and provided comfort and support despite risks. Complications were common, and night deliveries added stress and danger. Their work was critical to community survival. Psychological impact of nighttime illness and injury. Suffering in darkness was frightening. Pain and confusion were worsened by the lack of light and isolation. Fear of death or worsening conditions heightened anxiety. Family members stayed awake, watching and caring, often exhausted. Nighttime illness added a mental burden to the physical challenges, preventing nighttime. Hazards communities developed strategies to reduce risks, keeping living areas clear of obstacles to prevent falls, using simple lighting devices like rushlights or oil lamps when necessary, training family members in basic first aid, encouraging early bedtime to reduce nighttime activity and accidents. Prevention was the best defense. Summary: night as a time of vulnerability and care. The night increased risks for illness and injury, but it also revealed the strength of medieval families and communities. Through simple care, knowledge, and vigilance, they managed these dangers as best they could. Traveling after dark in medieval times was generally avoided due to the many dangers that came with it, but sometimes it was necessary. Merchants often needed to reach markets early in the morning or escape the daytime heat during summer months. Messengers carried urgent news or commands. Pilgrims embarked on long journeys, and sometimes people fled danger or sought refuge under the cover of darkness. Necessity, commerce, and survival pushed some to travel at night despite the risks. Night travel brought many threats. Highwaymen and bandits preyed on isolated travelers, making robbery and assault common fears. Travelers risked getting lost on poorly marked roads or paths, and they faced dangers from wild animals active after sunset. Physical hazards such as uneven terrain, rivers, and hidden ditches increased the risk of injury in darkness. All these dangers made night travel a risky and dreaded endeavor. Despite these risks, travelers adopted several precautions to improve their safety. Traveling in groups allowed mutual protection and assistance if trouble arose. Carrying torches or lanterns helped light the way and deter potential attackers. Travelers preferred familiar routes or relied on well-known landmarks to avoid getting lost. Journeys often started at dusk to maximize the use of daylight, and dangerous areas or the darkest hours were generally avoided. These strategies significantly improved the chances of a safe passage. Roads in medieval times often had inns or way stations where travelers could rest safely. These places provided shelter, food, and company, allowing travelers to break their journey and reduce exposure to nighttime dangers. Inns sometimes offered guarded stables or storage for belongings, making them critical stops on longer journeys. Whenever possible, travelers timed their progress to reach these safe havens before nightfall. Stories and legends from the medieval period frequently featured travelers who faced supernatural or real dangers at night. Tales of ghostly apparitions on lonely roads, encounters with thieves or mysterious strangers, and fears of curses or bad omens were common. Such stories reinforced cultural caution around traveling in the dark and fed into the general anxiety of the night. Despite the dangers, nighttime travel was essential for royal messengers carrying important orders, traders moving goods efficiently, and military movements that required stealth. In many cases, the urgency and secrecy of these journeys outweighed concerns for personal safety. However, most ordinary people preferred to avoid traveling after dark, staying home and safe within their villages. Night travel was often seen as a sign of desperation or danger, reserved only for those with urgent needs or special skills. In summary, traveling after dark was a dangerous undertaking in medieval times, filled with threats from humans, animals, and the environment. Yet, it was also a necessity for commerce, communication, and survival. The precautions travelers took and the social systems in place reveal how medieval people balanced their fear of the night with the practical demands of their lives. In medieval villages and towns, the cover of darkness brought out many creatures that could startle, threaten, or simply unsettle the people trying to rest or travel. Wolves, foxes, and wild boars roamed forests and fields, sometimes coming close to human settlements in search of food. Their eerie howls or rustling noises in the night could send even the bravest into a fearful state. The presence of these animals was a constant reminder of the wild, uncontrollable dangers lurking just beyond the safety of the hearth. Smaller creatures added to the unease. Rats and mice were common in homes and granaries, particularly attracted by stored food. Their scratching and scurrying at night could disturb sleep and suggest the presence of vermin spreading disease. Fleas and lice, though invisible in the dark, were an ever-present nuisance, often causing itching and discomfort that grew worse when lying still at night. Insects like mosquitoes, gnats, and moths became more active after sunset, sometimes swarming around lamps or people resting outdoors. Their bites could cause irritation and transmit illnesses, compounding the physical discomfort of nighttime. The constant buzzing and fluttering noises contributed to a restless environment, making it hard to find peace in the dark. Many animals carried symbolic meanings, often associated with omens or supernatural beliefs. Owls, with their haunting calls, were widely feared as harbingers of death or evil spirits. Bats were linked to darkness and witchcraft in popular folklore. These associations heightened people's anxiety whenever such creatures appeared near homes or along travel routes after dark. The natural sounds of animals and insects at night were often misinterpreted as something more sinister. Unfamiliar noises could be mistaken for ghosts, demons, or witches moving in the shadows. This blending of natural and supernatural fear amplified the psychological weight of nighttime for medieval people. Communities learned to live with these creatures by setting traps for vermin, keeping livestock secure, and maintaining fires or lanterns to deter wild animals. However, the unpredictability of the natural world after dark meant that fear was never fully eliminated. This constant tension between safety and danger shaped much of the medieval experience of night that in summary, night animals and insects played a significant role in medieval nighttime fear, both through real threats and symbolic meanings. Their presence affected how people rested, traveled, and thought about the dark hours, intertwining nature and belief in a powerful way. Thank you for staying with me through this exploration of medieval nights. If you found this journey into the past insightful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, helping others discover these hidden stories of history. The night in medieval times was far more than just the absence of daylight. It was a time filled with tangible dangers, wild animals roaming nearby, bandits lurking on dark roads, the threat of illness and injury without immediate care, and the unsettling sounds of creatures stirring in the shadows. The darkness concealed countless unknowns, feeding the imagination and turning simple noises into signs of supernatural terror. For medieval people, the night represented vulnerability. Without modern lighting or security, they faced real threats to life and health as the hours grew darker. Their homes, though sanctuaries by day, became places of heightened fear at night. The long, cold nights of winter were especially daunting, stretching hours of darkness and isolation. Survival depended on community vigilance, simple but effective precautions, and a deep cultural understanding of the night's risks. Moreover, night was deeply embedded in their beliefs and superstitions, where natural fears blended with stories of ghosts, spirits, and curses. The night was a space where the boundaries between the living and the unknown seemed thin, and fear became as much psychological as physical. In this way, medieval people feared the night not simply because it was dark, but because it represented a period when death, danger, and the unknown felt closest and most immediate. Their fears shaped their routines, their social bonds, and their very worldview. Understanding this fear helps us appreciate not only how far we have come with technology and knowledge, but also the resilience and adaptability of those who lived. In an age where nightfall was something to dread, sometimes even more than death itself. Thank you again for joining me. If you want to learn more about medieval life, nights, or other fascinating historical topics, stay tuned for the next videos.